Once that chemotherapy stopped, the cancer spread quite rapidly to the point where she ended up with tumours, obviously in her bowel, in her liver, spine, brain, lymph nodes, everywhere. And by the time that somebody realised that the cancer had spread so significantly, there was nothing more that can be done about it. And strangely enough, this is exactly the 1-year anniversary of when we were told that there was nothing more that could be done, and she had 2 to 4 weeks to live.
Hello, and welcome to Sketch Notes on a Pandemic. I'm Lucy Johnston, health editor of the Sunday Express. If you're interested in these conversations, please like and subscribe to Sketch Notes on a Pandemic. We'll have many more great guests coming soon. Today, we're going to be speaking to Craig Russel, founder of the Catch Up with Cancer campaign, whose 31-year-old daughter died in June 2020 after being refused cancer treatment 12 weeks earlier due to lockdown restrictions. Kelly Smith, a beauty therapist and single mother, leaves behind a 7-year-old son, Finn. Craig, who has met Matt Hancock, is working with charities and powerful parliamentary groups to raise the profile of what he believes is a huge and emerging crisis that he says the government has failed to acknowledge. I wonder if you could just talk us through that and why you started the campaign.
Hi, Lucy. Yes, of course. So Kelly was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer back in 2017. And over the following years, she'd been through a couple of major surgeries, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, clinical trials, everything you could think of. Because obviously at stage 4, there wasn't really an option of a cure, but all these various treatments she was going through were life prolonging. So she was on her 4th round of chemotherapy in January last year. And towards the end of March, she went into the hospital as usual. The process was always to get her bloods checked before chemotherapy, which they did. And just as she was expecting to start chemo, she was told that they weren't going to do it for this cycle, and that because of the risk of COVID, they recommended that Kelly went home and self-isolated for 12 weeks. So that she duly did, although she was quite angry and quite upset about that, because, like I said, the chemotherapy wasn't a cure, but what it was doing is it was slowing down the progression of the cancer. Once that chemotherapy stopped, the cancer spread quite rapidly to the point where she ended up with tumours, obviously in her bowel, in her liver, spine, brain, lymph nodes, everywhere. And by the time that somebody realised that the cancer had spread so significantly, there was nothing more that can be done about it. And strangely enough, this is exactly the 1-year anniversary of when we were told that there was nothing more that could be done, and she had 2 to 4 weeks to live.
So tell me I know Kelly has a 7-year-old daughter. He was Finn, 6 at the time. So in March 2020, she was told to go home and self-isolate. Why do you think that was unnecessary? I mean, had you previously been managing her immunocompromised position with, she's presumably, all infections could, you'd had to manage her condition with all infections. What do you think that was an unnecessary thing to do?
Yes, fundamentally, yes. There was always the risk of catching COVID, and let's face it, hospitals, I wouldn't say they were a hotspot, but there were obviously plenty of people being admitted there, so there was an elevated risk of her catching COVID. But I would always weigh up the fact that she may have caught COVID against the fact she has cancer. So, and that's how Kelly thought as well. It was very much a question of, why aren't we treating what I have now that will kill me against worrying about something I might never even catch? And whilst I understand that COVID for Kelly in her immunosuppressed state could have been potentially fatal, then in some respects that was a chance worth taking, because the cancer we knew would be fatal.
And you, now running the campaign, have heard of other people who've had similar stories. I mean, you've had quite a number of people who've come forward. Is that right?
Sadly, Lucy, this situation that we had with Kelly is far from an isolated occurrence. We've been contacted by a tragically large number of people who have been through very similar circumstances. For example, 1 week, I think October last year, I just put a post out and said, if anybody's had a similar experience, please let me know. And I think we got 52 responses.
My goodness.
Just from one post, which was out to a relatively small number of people. And since then, we have heard this happening time and time again.
Was there a right to choose? I mean, should they have been given a right to choose? Could she not have said, look, I'd rather take the risk of developing coronavirus against the risk of my not having this treatment? Was that not an option?
I think it should have been, yeah, for
and
sure.
It wasn't. It wasn't given to her as a choice. I suppose you listened to the clinician.
No, it was pretty much, that's what you need to do. And, with hindsight, maybe Kelly could have gone back and challenged it more, but she decided to go down a different route, which was to seek a second opinion. Of course,
too late.
It was too late, and of course there wasn't a doctor in sight that she could realistically go to, so we had to go privately, and I had a consultation with an oncologist on Harley Street. But again, because everything was slowed down because of a lack of resources, even getting things like a blood test done was taking 10 days. And by the time we were actually able to provide all the evidence to this consultant, it was effectively too late for him to do anything about it as well. If we'd been maybe a week earlier, there may have been options.
So during those last days and weeks, it was she? How was she? Was she angry? I mean, how was Finn, and how was he about it? How has the family dealt with it on an emotional level?
Kelly was surprisingly upbeat, but that was just the way she was. All through her cancer battles, she'd always tried to remain as positive as ever.
She's a beautician, isn't she? Yes, was a beautician.
Oh, yeah. Yes, she was.
And very kind. I remember you saying a very kind and giving person, which is one of the reasons why you feel you want to help people now. But yes, carry on.
So even though, Kelly didn't actually want to know how long she had left. Mandy and I both knew that it was 2 to 4 weeks, but Kelly just didn't really want to acknowledge it. And there were so many things that she'd wanted to do in her life that, because of the prognosis and also because of lockdown, she was never going to get to do them. So we tried to approach the thing as positively as we could, bearing in mind we couldn't actually go anywhere.
But did that not add sort of almost more to the tragedy of her death, in that you could not have, I gather, people at the hospice where she died, you couldn't have visitors, you couldn't have friends. That made it even more sort of, would you say, perhaps some people would call it inhumane. How were those last weeks? How do you remember them?
They were immensely challenging on so many different levels, Lucy. She knew she didn't have long. And of course, she had lots of friends, lots of family. She would have loved to have spent lots of time with everybody. Not so much to say their goodbyes, but, I think it's almost from a point of view of a sort of an emotional closure almost in some respects. And we were able, being very careful to have a few people come round and sit in the garden, even though technically that was probably against the rules, but quite frankly, under the circumstances, we thought well, what the hell? So she was able to see some of her friends, some family, but by no means could she see everybody she wanted to. So that in itself was stressful, and we were in this really strange dichotomy whereby we couldn't ignore the fact that Kelly didn't have one, but at the same time we were trying to keep as normal a life as possible because that's what she wanted, but also it was important to try and retain that stability for Finn as well.
And just talk a little bit about Finn, if you feel you can. But I know we've spoken before about how you feel he's not quite able to take on the full enormity of what's happened to probably the most important person in his life. She was a single mum, wasn't she? I remember. How does he's had little moments, I remember you saying.
Indeed he has, but there again, I would say we all do when we lose a parent. We only lost my mum in 2019, and even now, my mum was 87. So there's always that point of you losing a parent that leaves a degree of emotional scarring. I think with Finn being 6, he faces a different challenge because you don't necessarily have all those tens of years of history that you look back on that you can pull good points and bad points from. To have a sort of a balanced view on somebody's life. He never had that. Realistically, 3-4 years of memories with Kelly. So the impact on him in some degree was slightly lessened because you don't have that history. But I think also the emotional impact is potentially greater because, the most important person in his life, because let's face it, even as a dad, I would always admit mum is always the most important person. She's gone. She's not there. And I think he doesn't necessarily know how to process that, what is grief to a 6-year-old. And I think that is very different to all of us. And I think age has a very large bearing on that. So where he is now is, he does ask about Kelly quite frequently. He stayed with us on Sunday night and just asked a little question. So it's very hard to understand how he processes that. We know he is thinking about her because, I say, occasionally he does make comments or ask questions. But, we were slightly reluctant to push him into talking about it too much because, I think it's one of those things that we don't want to push him into a corner where we are making him confront his grief at a point where he's not emotionally ready. But at the same time, if he asks about Kelly, then we're very free and open talking to him about it.
Just one thing I do hear a lot of people say how resilient children are and how they can bounce through anything. But I think that's. What do you think about that?
I think kids are amazingly resilient, but I think at the end of the day, they're still people. They might be young, but they are still people.